Good morning, everyone, and welcome to session B1 of the International Research Mobility Symposium. For those of you who are just now joining us, my name is Karen Schwartz. I am the Associate Vice President, Research and International at Carleton University, and I am chair of this session. First up is Heather Horak, a music educator and ethnomusicologist who has recently completed her master's in the Music and Culture program at Carleton. Congratulations on completing your master's. Her fieldwork was based in Vienna, Austria, and spanned 9 different countries in Central Europe. Heather has just completed an ethnographic study of her own design with support from Heritage Canada on the impact of 1970s music in her local region in Quebec. Over to you, Heather.
The first thing we're going to do is watch a little 3-minute video that I made that summarizes my thesis research in Europe that you just mentioned, and you can roll that.
Hi, I'm Heather Horak, and what you're hearing is the sound of a small stringed instrument called the charango. The charango has deep roots and traditions in South America, but my research is about the charango's presence and musical activity outside of its homelands. How has the charango dispersed beyond its original geographies? What kind of music is being played on it, and by whom in foreign contexts? What can this kind of investigation reveal about the interaction between music making and cultural environments? To examine these questions, I interviewed charango players living in various locations in Europe to ask them about their musical lives and senses of identity.
My grandfather emigrated from a small village in southern Italy.
Patricio Zeoli is a charango and guitar player living in Germany. He was born in Argentina but raised in Ireland, where he grew up with a strong sense of his Latino roots in music despite his Irish surroundings.
And I really got to know, for example, Irish music very well. But interestingly enough, my whole pull was towards South America.
This feeling pulled him back to South America to study music in his 20s, and it was there he discovered the charango. He returned to Europe to play in street bands like many others in those times. These days, he collaborates with medieval musicians as well as with a jazz pianist in Hamburg. Zeoli is just one example of an artist who's brought the charango into new musical spaces because of the international reference points of his own story and identity. Each musician I met has a totally unique story that intersects with bigger global and historical forces: migration, politics, economics, and of course, the artistic tastes of these artists and their audiences. These stories of charango players living outside of traditional charango geographies provide a unique lens to observe and better understand the factors that shape and influence musical and cultural expression in our modern and globalized times.
Okay, so you might be wondering why I made that video, and the reason is because I wanted to win the $3,000. It was for the I think it's called the 3MT or something. It's a competition where you summarize your research in 3 minutes, and then, you know, the lucky winner gets $3,000. So I did not win that one, but it's a useful tool now for people who are interested in the research that I did. So in thinking about this symposium and kind of its focus and intent, I'm going to start with the conclusion, which is what I learned from doing cross-cultural research, or I don't know if that's the right word. There are so many factors involved in me being a white North American primary English speaker in European countries, various European countries, in the time that is now, where there were Eastern Europe and Western Europe was in the background, and I was speaking with Europeans who were of, mixed heritage, and I was speaking with Latin Americans who had been in Europe for 20 years, and all different kinds of people. So if there's any way to describe research that involves like multiple threads of positionality and culture, I would use that word. I don't know. If somebody knows that word, let me know. Otherwise, I'll just be making it up. So the things that I learned that I want to impart to the audience and participants who may already know this was, I think the most important thing to do in embarking on these sorts of ventures is to keep a learner's mind. You're a researcher. You may think you know things, but just suspend that and keep a learner's mind when you're approaching your subjects of your research and your performance, let's say, in this kind of case. And the second thing was to develop really good listening skills. And that's connected to the first point. Because even though, of course, you're supposed to have a hypothesis and you're supposed to kind of know what your results are going to be. And I always found that absurd in academia as a sort of an older person coming into academia again and, being asked for a hypothesis of my research findings. I always felt that was fairly absurd. But even though that's the case, that we may think we know what we're getting at, while you're doing research, especially if it's field work or it involves human subjects, just suspend that and have a learner's mind, practice really good listening skills. And what I found is when I went back over the interviews that I did, that I didn't have very good listening skills, that I often interjected and spoke about myself as a way to kind of connect with people. But I learned by listening back to the interviews and how I would cut people off and things like that. So when I did this recent project for Heritage Canada, I improved on that count. I just kept my mouth shut. And in keeping my mouth shut, more information came out of my interviewees. So, and now I have to get around quickly to the title of my talk, which is about hidden indigeneities or secretive indigeneities. As I interviewed, in particular, Latin Americans who were living in various places in Europe, some things emerged more slowly, partly because of my own positionality and ignorance on the topic. I mean, you can always learn more, but as background, in Latin America, there's different kinds of sort of cultural and class statuses that it's not clear lines, but there are basically 3 to 4 categories, and I'll just go over them really quickly. Kind of the more upper class in these contexts where the charango is a presence, and from it originates in these sort of cultural and regional landscapes. The upper class is called criollo, which is sort of a more European identified and perhaps European descended, and tend to be more in positions of privilege, perhaps lighter skin. This is all sort of very general and fluid. The next category would be mestizo, or what we would call in Canada, Métis, but it's not the same, but just to give you a reference point. I mean, I could do a 3-hour talk just on mestizo identity and culture, but that would be kind of like, kind of a group of people who are somewhat in between and sort of becoming more sort of aspiring towards a more criollo kind of status, but they're in the middle. And then unfortunately on the bottom of the heap are these indigenous identities. And coming from a North American context, especially in Canada, where now, if anything is related to indigenous or indigeneity, people just shout it from the rooftops because because it's a hot topic, because there might be more interest in it. So there's a very much, there's probably some similar issues historically in Canada, but in Latin America, what I found is in interviewing these people in Europe, if they were Indigenous in their origin, they wouldn't necessarily say that, and they didn't. And it turned out, of my 28 subjects, that 2 of them were Indigenous, derived from Indigenous roots in the highlands of the Andes. And they didn't tell me that in their interviews, although I asked point blank, because I thought they were kind of getting to that. And I was like, wait a minute, but so are you Indigenous? And they kept using euphemisms, which were the couple of euphemisms that came up with. One was from the mountains, and another one was campesino, which means like a country person. So anyway, I have no idea how much time's gone by. So just kind of wrap it up to say, going back to that learner's mind and suspending what you think you know, it's just so important, because whether you're aware of it or not, you're carrying a positionality that the other person is going to be responding to. And in reflecting afterwards why they may or may not have revealed that, there are many, many levels that I can't get into, but one may have been who I was and who they perceived me to be. And they may have perceived me to be somebody who they didn't feel would respect them if because of what has happened over 500 years of history. This may be all unconscious. It may be built into language things. We were speaking Spanish, which was a second language for me. There's so many layers to it. So I would say you can't really be neutral, because you are who you are, and you carry your own positionality, your own history, your own perspective, your own agenda, whether you want to have one or not. You have one. Carleton is giving you, that's your mandate, to have an agenda. So just staying in that learner's mind, practicing your listening skills, and not being afraid to kind of learn as you go. It's very natural. You may have read every book on every subject in the world, but when you get face to face in a fieldwork situation, a lot of that doesn't matter. It just comes down to kind of winging it and trying to come from a good place where your intentions are good and you're humble. So that's kind of my wrap for now. And how much time do I have, Vivian? Is that it? Is that good?
Unfortunately, that's it. Thank you very much, though, Heather. That was very, very informative. Next, I'd like to introduce Sophie Kühnlenz to share a few words. Sophie is a public historian and a Marie Curie doctoral fellow at the ARTES Humanities program at the University of Cologne in Germany. Her research focuses on the change of doing gender in museums of industry and technology in German-speaking countries from the 1990s to the present. Sophie is the co-founder and speaker for students and young professionals in the working group on applied public and public history of the Association of Historians in Germany. She's also a member of the International Federation for Public History. Please go ahead, Sophie.
Yeah, hello everyone, and thank you for the kind introduction, and sorry for the long titles of all these institutions. Germans like long names. Today I want to share with you how Carleton brought me onto my current research track, even though I'm not focusing on Canada anymore. My story starts in 2017. I studied public history in Berlin and started looking for a topic for my master's thesis, and back then I wasn't familiar with Canadian history at all. And I was wondering why North American studies, at least in Germany, tend to focus almost exclusively on US American history. And back then I was in a lucky position to hold a scholarship, and the foundation encouraged us to go abroad. So I decided to use this advantage once more and designed a thesis project focusing on a museum representation of the second wave feminist women's movement in German and Canadian museums. So I spent 2 months in Canada doing field research at the Museum of Vancouver in British Columbia and the Canadian Museum for Human Rights in Winnipeg, and always thought about coming back ever since. And in summer 2017, I met David Dean, who was a public history professor here at Carleton, at a conference of the International Federation for Public History. And 1 year later, I applied for PhD funding and found the mentioned Artis Humanities program, which is an EU co-fund. And for the global track, there is this obligatory mobility phase of 1.5 years. So, and this immediately caught my attention because this was my chance to go back to Canada. So I applied with a project focusing on gender representations in national history museums in Berlin, Ottawa, and Washington, so Germany, Canada, and the US, and how they changed their way of doing gender over time. I got accepted and arrived at Carleton in January 2020 to work with David Dean and to do my field research at the Canadian Museum of History in Gatineau for the next 1.5 years. As you all know, Corona had a different plan in mind. I left after only 3 months in the end of March, but nevertheless, these 3 months in Canada were crucial for the development of my project. My goal in Ottawa was to find out how the History Museum deals with gender as a research category in its collection and exhibitions. Questions like, do curators reflect about gender imbalances in the past and in the present? Is gender a relevant category when it comes to acquiring new objects? Is gender as a constructed, not an essentialist category reflected in the structuring of the collections? How differentiated is the representation of gender and queer diversity in the museum? How important is it for the museum to attract a diverse audience with a variety of gender-sensitive topics and perspective? So overall, what role does gender play in everyday museum practice? But before I could even start researching these questions at the History Museum, David brought me in touch with curators from Ingenium's Science and Technology and Aviation and Space Museum in Ottawa. And this turned out to be a great opportunity because the Ingenium curators I met were already working. Oh, thank you for changing the slides. Sorry, I forgot about that. So the Ingenium curators I met were already working on questions of gender-sensitive museum practices. And after I visited both museums, I started to read about feminist science and technology studies. So in short, Carleton provided the starting point to develop my new research focus, which is how do museums of industry and technology deal with gender in collections and exhibitions? How do they do gender? So in the following weeks, I tried to adapt my project accordingly. 3 research fields are relevant for my project. First of all, critical museum studies. Scholars in these fields analyze museums regarding their representational strategies, and museums are criticized as key actors for collecting and interpreting the past. Following from that, I analyze museums as gendered institutions that and construct history based on material traces, things that museums interpret from a specific viewpoint from the present. Consequently, museums don't show how it was, they reconstruct how it could have been. But as you might know, the whole museum system, the architecture, the physical collections, the task of preserving the past and the certification of its exhibitions are all put together to objectify the stories they tell. That these stories are reconstructions based on things tends to retreat into the background, and this is what I'm trying to investigate from a gender perspective. The second field that is relevant is public history, and public history asks how history is dealt with in public. Museums are a great place to study this because they're public institutions playing a significant role in how we look upon history, especially with its physical leftovers from the past as evidence for its stories. And the third field, of course, is gender studies, or as mentioned already, feminist science and technology studies. And so gender studies developed within second wave feminists and pointed out that institutions and practices are based on gendered assumptions or stereotypes and are not neutral. And the feminist science and technology studies transferred these theories into the highly gendered fields of science and technology and point out the situatedness of scientific knowledge production in these fields. So in my thesis, I'm trying to connect these fields to find out how museums, like the Museum of Work you see on the left side and the Technical Museum in Vienna, changed their way of based on Donna Haraway's concept of situated knowledges. Shortly after diving into this field, I had to leave Ottawa due to the pandemic and ever since focus on museums in Germany and Austria, mainly for practical reasons. My title, the Marie Curie phenomenon, refers to the Polish-French scientist Marie Curie, who was a chemist and a physicist, and coined the term radioactive. And as you might know, she won 2 Nobel Prizes and is presented in many museums of science and technology. But if we talk about doing gender in museums, meeting Marie Curie is initially a good sign. But however, if she is only presented as a female exception of a male rule, there can be no question of a gender-sensitive museum practice. And this is what I call the Marie Curie effect. Women in science and technology as exception from the male rule without reflecting on this male rule in the circumstances, why we still have such a gender imbalance in these fields is not gender sensitive, it's just adding some really famous women to the story. And if you have to win 2 Nobel Prizes before being categorized as museum worthy, there's much left to do in this regard. Please, the last slide. For my intercultural experience, I chose 2 topics shortly. One was the 26th annual Underhill Grad Student Colloquium that I had a chance to be part of. And this was my first experience to chair a panel, which I never did before. And which was a great experience because I once more experienced that people from English-speaking academic fields are way more comfortable presenting freely than scholars in Germany probably ever will. And the second picture is one of my favorite hobbies, swimming. I am an experienced swimmer and had a chance to swim with the Carlton Masters for a couple of weeks. And at first, it wasn't really easy for me to understand the plan and the explanations of the coaches, because I had never had training in English before. But after a few sessions, I understood all the abbreviations on the board. But the most irritating aspect that stuck with me over the last weeks and months was that I had to swim the other way around. So up on the left side and back on the right side. And so if you swim all your life the other way around, this really made my brain started working in a way I never expected before I came to Canada. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Sophie. Yeah, it's little things like that make your brain have to contort a bit, that stick with you. So thank you. Up next, we will hear from Johann González. Johann is a PhD student in information technology who conducted research about direct manipulation with flexible devices at Carleton University and Université de Lille in France. Johann participated in an international exchange at the National Institute of Applied Sciences in Lyon with a 10-month internship at Creatis, which is a medical imaging research center in France. Later, he participated as a visiting student researcher with the Emerging Leaders in America program, which we refer to as ELAP. Johann, take it over, please.
Hi, Karen. Thank you very much. Well, thanks, Carleton, for having me and allow me to share my experience with you. I am Felipe. I am Colombian. I have 2 bachelor's degrees in engineering in Los Andes University in Colombia. And I have a master's as well in systems and computer engineering in Los Andes also. Currently, I'm doing my PhD in Carleton. During my master's degree in Colombia, I was granted in 2019 with the Emerging Leaders of the Americas Program Scholarship. And I had the opportunity to come to Canada to work as a researcher in the Creative Interaction Laboratory with the Professor Rob Tither for 6 months in cooperation with my master's supervisor in Colombia. And this is the work that I would like to share with you today. Next slide, please. So my work was focused in virtual reality. Virtual reality has its story already, but now we can enjoy it easier because the lower cost of the devices. It creates an immersion experience in a virtual world, and well, we all love it because it's cool. I'm sure most of the people that have experienced VR before will agree with me. Interesting thing is that the user is not only an observer, but an actor. So you can influence the world where you are. But the problem is the level of the interaction you have with object is limited. often some of the commercial devices you find will allow you to manipulate objects with a pair of controllers you can use in your hands. And sometimes it's not easy to receive feedback from the virtual world. For example, if I'm walking in the virtual scenario and you face a wall, you can just cross it and not feeling that sensation that the object is just in front of you. So regarding this area, we wanted to focus in one specific problem, that is, how can you manipulate objects? So one way is, and it was the first approach that you can find, is you can make gestures with your hands. With some devices, the system are going to track your hands, and for example, pinching the air, you're going to be able to move or rotate the object. The problem is that this is not realistic. So other solution you can have is controlling objects with the controllers of the device. So with one of two controllers in your hand, you can manipulate objects, right? Pressing buttons. For example, I'm just pressing the trigger to grab the object and moving the controller to move the object as well. You can even also receive vibration from the controller as a feedback, for example, that you have the object in your hand or you have released it. But the problem is that this is better than grabbing on just the air. But the problem is that it's not realistic, or not really realistic. I mean, you want to feel the object, the shape, the textures, the weight of the object you are manipulating. So this takes us to the third option that you can see in the right part. That is, you can have props, like a specific object that have, for example, similar shape in real world than in virtual world. So if you are in the virtual world, you're going to manipulate the object, and in real world, you actually, for example, take a box so you can feel the experience more realistic. But the problem here is that, just imagine, for example, you're in a training scenario, for example, for, I don't know, mechanic engineers trying to fix an engine. And you will need the different types of objects to manipulate. So you're going to need one prop for each one of the objects you are going to find in VR. And that it's kind of difficult, not only because you're going to need different props, but that because the system is going to need to track the positions and orientation of the objects. So this is the problem we wanted to address, like how manipulate different objects with different shapes to make to provide a realistic experience in VR in an easy way. Next slide, please. So our approach is focused in two parts. The first one, I need an object that can emulate different shapes. So we used an object called Adaptic that is basically a deformable and a shape-changing device. The object is going to change its shape automatically, following some instructions from the system when it's required. So now I am in VR and I have the possibility to have different shapes in real world to emulate different shapes in virtual world. The problem is that now I have only one object, and you are going to, I mean, you want to manipulate different objects in VR. So for this one, we create the illusion of multiple locations with a technique called object retargeting. That is basically that when you have your headset in your head, I can manipulate what you are seeing. For example, if you have your hand in the just in face in the middle of the just in face of you, I can put it in the right side of the screen, for example. So playing with this kind of lies, if you want, I can force your hand to go a different position that you think you're going. So with this, for example, in the screen, in the box in the middle, this is just what I said. So in the first row, in the top, the person is going to the right side of the table, and the virtual hand is going to the right hand of the table. But when I apply the haptic retargeting, I can do what is happening in the second row, that you are actually going to the center of the table and your hand in virtual world is going to the right part. So with this, combining these two solutions, I can make the user think they are using different objects with different shapes using just one. And this device is going to be placed in the same spot in the table in real world, but in virtual reality, you're going to think that it's placed in different locations. So we conducted an experiment with about 20 participants in Carleton University. You have two pictures there of the actual experiment, and we have very good results. So it's a promising approach. The haptic retargeting it didn't affect the performance significantly, and even more important, the participant didn't notice they were under the effect of the haptic retargeting. So this is just regarding about the experiment and the experience in the research area. Now I would like to share about my experience as a multicultural exchange. Could you give me the next slide, please? So as I said, I was granted with the Emerging Leaders in the Americas program, and it's a scholarship that basically allow people from Latin America and Caribbean coming to Canada and perform research. And well, this is an experience that I think that always enriches you as a person, as a professional. This is not the first time that I did an international exchange, but in both cases, the result was the same. It gives you a new perspective in life, in an academia. You start to see things in a different way. When you live your whole life in the same country, you don't used to ask questions about why things are in the way they are until you get and you face a different reality in different countries. You have new ideas because your creativity comes from what you know, your culture, your language. You used to come with solutions that are similar to the solutions you already have in your environment. So when you change the environments where you're living and you share thoughts and ideas with people from different cultures, you start to have a different perspective. Your creativity increases. Another important aspect is the networking. Well, it's important to let other people know your work and for you to know other people's work. And an example of that is that as a result of my work in Carleton University, I had the opportunity to meet who is my supervisor now in my PhD in Carleton. So that's good. And the last thing that I mentioned here is learning languages. This is something that well, before I traveled the first time to a different country, I have to admit that I didn't like languages until you see how used they are and how beautiful it is when you know another person and you can talk in different languages, because you can express different things in different languages. I mean, it's not the same speaking your native language with other person, and when you're forced to speak in a different language, try to communicate yourself. The picture you find in the right side of the slide, it was during the labs program. We were selected, a small group of people in this program, to go to an academic tour through 3 different cities in Canada: Toronto, Ottawa, and Quebec City, to know more about the political and academic system here in Canada. And I think that's it. I'm glad to receive all your questions if you want to know something else. Thank you very much.
Thank you. So if all the presenters can turn their cameras on, and I will start with Heather and then Sophie and then Johann and present questions. So Heather, the question that came up for you is, how does music expand your view on Latin America?
Well, that's interesting, because I would say that my knowledge of Latin America is very much through music, because I'm a musician. I've been a musician since I was a child, and I've been involved and close and intersecting with both Latino people in North America and in various traveled and lived and spoken the language. So for me, it's very intricately related. And I would say that, you know, as a musicologist, that music reveals just as much about social, cultural, political, historical life as anything else that any society has as part of any society. science, anything, that, you know, everything is a window into the whole.
Thank you. Thank you. That's a beautiful answer. Sophie, are you there?
Yes, now
Okay.
also with tone.
So I have a question for you. What are some techniques that you think museums can use to do a better job in highlighting the work of women in science while avoiding the trap of presenting them as curious exceptions?
Yeah, this is an interesting question and a very hard question. Of course, it's easier to criticize museums from the outside than to come up with techniques to make it better in the inside. What I usually answer to that question is that it makes sense to look at technology and technology development in the context. So not just focus on the machine you have here that can do certain things, but to look at who invented it, who used it, who worked with it, who made it possible that someone else could develop this idea and to come up with this technology. And I would say it still does make sense to look for women and their contributions in science, because we haven't recovered all the stories about women in science and technology yet. And when we have this collection of women's contributions, we can focus on why we have such a gender imbalance in science and tech fields. Why is it possible for so many men over so many years and centuries, you could say, to develop so many great ideas and innovations, and other people weren't able to do that? Because it's not the reason that they're not intelligent enough or anything. It was just a question of opportunity and context, and this is what we have to look for in museums.
Thank you. Thank you. Very interesting. Johann, how do virtual realities technologies impact our ability to better understand the physical world?
Well, that's an interesting question because one important thing about virtual reality is that you're not limited to the constraints you have in real life, right? So that's why it's a very good solution for those scenarios when, for example, people need training, but the training can be expensive or dangerous, right? So it's a very, very interesting question, because you start to think, what is the difference between virtual world and real world? So you start to do all those connections, and basically is how can you perceive, what are the channels you have to perceive the real world? Your eyes, your touch, the sense of your ears, and this. So this is in this point when you can start to analyze the real world in terms of virtual reality, when you try to transport these feelings and these sensations to real world. Because before that, you don't even ask yourself, I mean, like, where is the importance to see? Where for us that can do it freely, but it's in that point that you can understand better for me the real world.
Thank you. Heather, back to you. So I was wondering if you could speak a bit more about the impact of our individual identities or positionality and culture on our experiences of international research mobility.
It's something that gets talked about in the it's talked about a lot in the humanities, this idea of positionality, and I don't know if it's talked about in the sciences, but it should be. If it's not, then that would answer a lot of questions about why we're in the pickle we're in internationally. This has to be a topic in every field, I think, and it stretches across everything. But yeah, I guess I didn't realize that I was speaking as if I was speaking to a group of Canadian researchers, but I would say, you know, positionality has a lot to do with understanding the past and understanding power relationships and privilege and colonial history. And that's all like a big topic in humanities. But I would say on a very personal level, I can't, as someone who's a female and done a lot of cross-cultural work in Latin America with Latin Americans, there are so many levels all the time of this stuff going on. Right away, our brain makes associations, like say they're well dressed or something. They look neat and they have a suit on or something. We make all kinds of associations with that affect how we behave and how we perceive and how we think and what we say and how we say it. And this is, you know, an intrinsic part of humanity. So I think my whole message of my talk, to have a learner's mind, I didn't really explain what I meant by that, but just to kind of suspend your know-it-allness. You think you know something, you probably do know quite a lot, but it's your knowing something isn't going to help you collect the epistemology of someone else. So the point of view, the ideas, the experiences, what you know isn't going to help you receive information. So to suspend that is to kind of account for, it's the only way you can sort of suspend the impact of your positionality, which of course you can't, but you have to be able to work within those frameworks. So that's kind of what I'm saying. And I'm also a teacher and a lifelong learner. So when I say the phrase learner's mind, and I guess I would hope that researchers in every field do that. Like you come to a research question with a whole bunch of study and knowledge behind you that leads you to that research question. But if you're going to succeed in revealing anything new, you have to be able to let go of everything you think you know in order to have something new appear. And I just find this is globally true. And also, if we all did that, we'd be a lot more humble and there would be a lot less in the world. Fill in the blank.
Thank you, Heather. So I have one, I actually have two more questions, but I'll pose a question to Sophie, and then Johann, hopefully we'll have time. I can pose the next question to you. So Sophie, do you find any significant differences of gender museum practices between Canada and Germany?
Wow.
A small question that you can answer in a minute, right?
Certainly. I would say gender and also queer history is way more I don't know, established in Canada than in Germany, and especially in the fields of science and technology, and when it comes to museums, because in Germany I think we have the problem, we have these big technology museums that are over 100 years old, and these museums were founded by engineers who were trying to build themselves a temple to celebrate their own achievements. And this is the history you can still see in there. And if you go there and tell them, please look at the cultural history of technology development, they say, what? And so in general, I would say, especially the Science and Technology Museum in Ottawa, they have some good approaches to look at technology in context, and to look for women, and to look for an object does not tell one story, but it's like a yeah, I don't know the word for it. It's like a code that you can deconstruct and look for different layers of meaning and stories that are bound to this object. And if we take that seriously, I think we've got a long and great way to go. But it's hard to tell someone to look at technology from a different viewpoint than just by its function and who invented it. And yeah, I think there's a lot of exchange possible.
Thank you. Thank you. Okay, Johann, you get the last question, even though we're over time. How can we combine virtual reality and management?
Thank you. Well, that's a complex question to answer, because I think management has a lot of fields that you could apply virtual reality, but two things comes to my mind like quickly. The first one is that the efforts that you can find to present information in an effective way done, and it's just a proof that how important it is for managers to understand the data. So in virtual reality, you have a wider field to present and create new mechanisms to present data. Something important, I mean, for managers, it's the management of data. It's crucial factor of the production. That's the first thing. The second one is in logistic chains of productions, you can simulate different scenarios that is easy to understand and see when you're in VR. I mean, you can see in almost every development of software. In any case, it's better if you can see what the things before you implement them, right? Because if you find errors to fix, it's much cheaper. So it's the same idea. If I can emulate a whole system of production before implemented, it's easier to identify possible errors before, and well, of course, cheaper.
Thank you very much. Well, this concludes session B. Thank you to all of our speakers. It was a pleasure hearing about your research. Thank you. Bye-bye.